Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about one of the most common fallacies that people engage in, logical fallacies, and it certainly comes up in spades for the abortion debate. And before I get into it, I just want to mention, in this month we've got Dr. Tim Barber and my book, Expressly Human, 10 years in the making on the origins of emotional expressions, why we have them, how they work, what masks destroy, because our true language is really emotional expressions. You can pre-order today. It's going to be coming out in a couple weeks. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so forth. The slippery slope fallacy, we've talked about it before. Briefly, I talked about it in moment 66. And I think it's a highly intuitive mistake to make. And the mistake is, in fact, when people often mention the slippery slope fallacy, people are often mentioning it and then using it in the exact wrong way. So sometimes people will say, oh, well, if you go down that path, it's a slippery slope, and then it leads all the way down to this other, sake, and you'd make this slippery slope fallacy. No, that's not the fallacy. The fallacy is to engage in that exact argument that you just did. That's the mistake. So the fallacy, the slippery slope fallacy, is to see that there's a slippery slope and say, well, I can't see where there would be any line anywhere on here that would allow me a distinction to be made between this far extreme and this other far extreme. There's no clear delineation point, and because there's no clear delineation point, there mustn't be a distinction between these two. So, for example, this happens on the pro-choice side, the extreme pro-choice side, who say, well, clearly a zygote is not a full-fledged person that deserves protection and so forth. It's something that's being constructed to become a person at some point, but it's clearly not a person. It's a single cell, which is astronomically different than the nature of what a person is, which is, there couldn't be anything more different than a single cell and some kind of baby, right? They're fundamentally different kinds of things. So clearly a zygote is not a person would be their presumption, and there's no clear line in the development of a zygote to a baby where suddenly it goes from zygote to baby. So you could never find some point to say that, okay, now is the point where you shouldn't be allowed to have an abortion, and so therefore 8.5-month fetuses should be allowed to be aborted. That would be the kind of argument. So zygote is clearly not a person, there's no clear line, and so therefore an 8.5-month fetus is also not a person. Now, that's a bad argument, because this slippery slope argument, so there's no line, is a bad argument, because lots of stuff is happening in there, and just our inability to find a line is not an argument. So and it happens the other way around. Extreme pro-life folks, many of them, will just say, well, clearly an 8.5 month fetus is a baby, and there's no clear delineation point where you could possibly say that you go from not a baby or not a person or not something of morally worthwhile to something that is a baby. There's no clear point in any of that. So it's got to be at the clear line, which is conception. Also, a bad argument for the same way. Now, you could come up with arguments maybe on either side that actually justifies why it's a baby from conception, or it's allowed to be aborted right up, before. Maybe there's sophisticated arguments, but these arguments ain't sophisticated. This is exactly the mistake. So, why are they mistakes? They're mistakes, and they're mistakes in other parts of your life. Because if I was to say to you, and we talked about baldness and heap and chair and cup and cake, and so one example is batter. You put it in the oven and it turns into a cake. It is going through just large sequences of changes as it cooks, and you could say, well, what point did it become a cake? What point did batter become a cake? And of course there is no point. There's some massive gray area, and the lines at the beginning of the gray area and the end of the gray area are also completely indeterminate. You can't figure out where those lines are exactly either. But that doesn't mean there's not a distinction between batter and cake. That doesn't mean that there's no distinction, there's no such thing as baldness versus not being bald, just because we can't find a to-the-hair distinction that distinguishes it. Same for heap and the Sorites paradox, which, just to remind you, Sorites paradox from the Greek is 1 grain of sand does not make a heap. It's true, you can't make a heap out of 1 grain of sand. And if you've got n grains of sand and it can't make a heap, then n plus 1 grains of sand couldn't make a heap. There's never a 1 grain of sand distinction between being able to make a heap and being not able to make a heap. But the problem is that those two things, the premise And that sort of inductive step suggests that there are no heaps, but of course there are heaps. These things pervade all of language. So you shouldn't expect, if it's the case, that they pervade cups and chairs and dogs and cats and tails and everything. Every concept in your world has clear cases on either side, in this massive vague gray area in between, which has unclear delineation points. These things happen in every facet of your life. Every concept is like that. But it doesn't mean we go, oh, I don't believe there's a distinction between all of those things and their negatives, their opposites. No, we know that there really are cups and not cups, or stools and chairs, and some kind of continuum that makes them morph into each other. And just because we can morph them from one to another with no clear line doesn't mean I don't believe in stools and chairs. That would be absurd. So why should we expect it that when you get into political conversations, ethical conversations on abortion just being topical now, that suddenly with these extra, why should it be, you expect that it's going to be simpler if it's the origins in the moment of life or personhood or babyhood, and that these things are easy on the other side. These things are not. They have all of these same fundamental gray areas and lines between the gray areas. Now, this is something that I've researched. I researched this back as part of my dissertation. My idea was to explain from computational limitations of any finite creature anywhere in the universe. Any finite creature anywhere in the universe, if they want to have maximal power to describe the concepts and carve up the world with kinds of concepts and use computable software in your brain to do that, well then a necessary consequence of that was that you're going to end up with concepts where you have clear cases and then clear negative cases, but you're going to end up with these vague regions in between for which you're unclear what's going on, and you're unclear even where those vague regions start and stop. It turns out to be it's a fundamental consequence of being a finite machine and the computational constraints that go with it, which concerns undecidability and a whole different conversation I can get into another time. So I have a specific theory for why I think these things happen, why they're necessary, why they're in fact good, given to avoid it you'd have to have really kind of weak concepts and not be able to describe the world very well. But a side effect of this sort of the need to have maximal descriptive power of the world is that you still end up with these holes between the clear cases on either side. And they're unseeable holes. You don't know where they start and stop. That's what we call vagueness. And the slippery slope fallacy is to assume that just because there's vagueness or inability to find a clear distinction point, that there's no distinction between opposite sides. Now, some people have been making this argument more towards the pro-life folks on Twitter. And a lot of these folks, oh my gosh, you're pointing out that my argument is fallacious. So you're pro-choice, you're extreme pro-choice. And I haven't really been pushing towards pro-choice, who make this, many of them, some of them make the same kind of argument, but in the opposite direction, the way I described it earlier. The point is not whether one is pro-life or whether one is pro-choice. If you really are pro-life, then do you want to rest your argument on a logical fallacy, one that has been known for 2,000 years? That's your argument? That is there are arguments you can come up with. Maybe they're just theological arguments. Maybe there's something more sophisticated. Maybe they're just something on the basis of it is not a person per se, you could imagine, but still we want to have respect for it because of the dangers of government, of eugenics, or you can have lots of different kinds of arguments. But the argument that you can't do is that I can find no clear line between here and an 8.5 month, fetus, which is clearly a baby. That is a logical fallacy. So what I would love to see is followers to say, okay, I'm not going to hate on Mark just because he's pointing out a logical fallacy. You know what that does is it helps you come up with a better justification for your beliefs. Now, it constrains you a little bit. You can't use a crappy argument that you've been using. But do you want your opponents to be using non-fallacious arguments, or are you just happy to use them? No, nobody should be happy to use fallacious arguments. A fallacious argument can be used to prove anything, about anything. You find that you're using a fallacious argument, you have nothing, right? All right. So, I'll wrap it up there. That was your science moment. And again, we'd love it if you could support us at FreeX, freex.group, which is our first output on the origins of emotional expressions. And really, this is what the kinds of things that happen at the network level. We also discuss in here reputation networks, how free expression works in society to bring us freedom. And that was your science moment.